Every year, thousands of tourists visit America's national parks to escape the hustle and bustle of city life, breathe fresh air, and enjoy the beauty of unspoiled nature. But not everyone returns with pleasant memories. Today, you will hear 3 terrifying and completely different stories about how ordinary tourists who set out to enjoy the beauty of America's national parks encountered inexplicable horror. Their bodies were found mutilated with huge wounds and injuries that could not be explained by an attack from a normal animal. But why did the authorities so hastily attribute these terrible incidents to bears or grizzlies, hiding the shocking details from the public? In the summer of 1995, a tragedy occurred in the area of the famous Yosemite National Park, about which contradictory rumors still circulate. Michael and Jennifer Owen, a couple from Northern California, were on vacation near one of the park's attractions, a picturesque waterfall that draws thousands of travelers every year. They arrived in the evening, chose a comfortable spot, and pitched their tent near a rocky ledge with a good view of the mountain peaks and the roaring water. Other tourists who had settled nearby noted the Owens' friendliness and kindness. They had time to chat with their neighbors and exchange tips on short trails and weather conditions. However, on the very first night, their peaceful vacation turned into a nightmare that ended with a gruesome discovery at dawn. The morning after Michael and Jennifer arrived, the peaceful camp by the waterfall was shaken by terrible news. In the morning, someone from a neighboring tent, wanting to wish them a good day, discovered that their tent had been partially torn and there were bloodstains around it. Several people immediately called for help, and within minutes, dozens of alarmed tourists gathered at the scene. Deeper in the thick grass and bushes, the bodies of Michael and Jennifer were found scattered a short distance apart. Witnesses described what they saw as the most gruesome scene imaginable. Both Owens had torn clothing, severe soft tissue damage, deep claw marks on their arms and chest, and some of their bones were clearly broken, as if someone had broken them with tremendous force. From that moment on, the camp was filled with screams of horror and panic as people could not understand what had happened. On the same day, a ranger named Harold Mitchell was the first to arrive at the scene, having been informed by radio of suspicious noises and a possible attack on tourists. He looked around, assessed the situation, and tried to figure out where the Owens were at the time of the tragedy. As an experienced park employee, Mitchell knew well what animal tracks looked like: bears, coyotes, cougars, and even deer that had accidentally wandered down from the mountains. He was the first to notice several distinct prints of large bare feet in the ground near the torn tent. Looking at them, he felt an unfamiliar sense of horror. The size of the footprints was significantly larger than a normal male foot, and the width was such that it looked like it belonged to a giant. However, the mounting panic, the cries of the people around him, and the risk of further attacks forced the ranger to abandon his careful examination of the footprints and focus on evacuating the remaining tourists. About an hour later, several more rangers and local police officers arrived. They warned those present that the leading theory was that the attack had been carried out by a grizzly bear. Such cases, although rare, had occurred in Yosemite when an animal, sensing food in tents or feeling threatened, attacked people. But those who saw the mutilated bodies and strange tracks began to have doubts. First, bear paw prints are quite familiar to local experts. They are not at all like large bear footprints with distinct toes. Second, severe lacerations and broken bones could certainly be the result of an attack by a large predator. But it remained unclear why there were no obvious signs of the victims being dragged or bear claw marks on the ground around them. Neighboring tourists who had spent the night by the waterfall claimed that in the middle of the night they heard muffled cries, followed by what sounded like a dull growl. Some thought it was coming from the nearby grove. Maybe there were coyotes or bears roaming around, while others thought it was just a couple in the neighboring tent, joking around or arguing. No one expected such a horrific outcome, so no one dared to look outside. When rangers began questioning people in more detail, some admitted that the growling sounded strange, as if interspersed with wheezing, more like human or throaty breathing than the characteristic roar of an animal. But these statements did not seem to be reflected in the official report. 2 days later, authorities announced in the news that Michael and Jennifer Owen had been killed by a bear. The press release coincided with the scene being cordoned off with caution tape and completely cleared. Rangers led by employees of the Wildlife Protection Agency collected all possible evidence and covered the ground with fresh sawdust. When journalists arrived at the scene, they were forbidden from passing the barriers, citing risk to their lives. In the end, reporters had to settle for statements from officials. They said it was a large animal that had allegedly been scared away from the park. However, no journalist was able to find any eyewitnesses who had seen this bear. In addition, no predator culling operations were reported in the area, which is usually done in the event of an attack, and no one reported the animal's whereabouts. Behind the scenes, park employees whispered that the statement about the bear was a strange substitution of facts. Those who personally saw the bodies and traces near the tent said that everything looked too illogical for a standard bear attack. According to experts' estimates, the barefoot footprints belonged to a creature at least 2 meters tall, which would have weighed a tremendous amount. But the evidence was quickly removed, and officials worked to close the case to the public as quickly as possible. The most incredible rumors began to spread, from traditional legends in the region about Bigfoots or Sasquatch to suggestions that someone had deliberately staged the attack by a wild animal. The Owen family tried to get more clarity and find out the details of the investigation from the authorities. But the police responded evasively, insisting that all the facts confirmed the bear version. In cases involving the death of tourists, it is often preferable to close off access to the site quickly so as not to damage the park's reputation. Here, the cleanup process was particularly quick and thorough. By the morning of the 3rd day, not only had the personal belongings disappeared, but so had the remains of the tent. Anything that could have contained traces was removed. Satellite images, which journalists wanted to use to check the situation from above, also proved useless. Nothing could be seen through the tree canopy and coastal fog. Some tourists who arrived in the following weeks were curious why the area around the waterfall was blocked off and when it would reopen. They were told that restoration work and safety checks were being carried out on the trails. As a result, none of the ordinary people were able to see the site of the tragedy with their own eyes, which had already been heavily processed by rescuers and officials. When several activist investigators tried to sneak in at night, they were stopped by patrols. Since then, any information about this story has taken the form of rumors and speculation, while official materials, of course, confirmed that it was an attack by an angry bear. Years passed, and this incident kept popping up in backroom conversations. Some rangers said they had seen something strange in Yosemite on more than one occasion: huge silhouettes in the shadows, heavy footsteps leaving barefoot prints in the mud by the rivers. But all this remained at the level of myths, which the general public did not particularly believe. And yet, when the tragedy of Michael and Jennifer Owen is mentioned, one cannot help but recall those footprints near their torn tent, and it becomes clear that the official version may have been too convenient a cover for something more incomprehensible and terrifying. Perhaps someone or something roams the wild heart of the national park at night, unseen by human eyes. Perhaps it only reveals itself occasionally in moments of violent carnage, leaving behind traces of blood and footprints that do not exist in official records. Whatever the case of Michael and Jennifer Owen remains one of the most mysterious and controversial in Yosemite's history. And to this day, no one has been able to provide a convincing answer as to what really happened that summer of 1995. In the summer of 2009, Jack Murphy and Kathleen Murphy, along with their 2 children, Tammy and Oliver, went to Glacier National Park to spend a few days camping by the picturesque Lake McDonald. According to friends who had been there before, this lake was famous for its crystal clear water and impressive views of the mountain peaks. Jack, an avid amateur fisherman, planned to try trout fishing at dawn, while Kathleen wanted to show her children the beauty of the parks so that they would appreciate nature more. The first 2 days of the Murphy family's stay were uneventful. During the day, they walked along the surrounding trails and explored secluded coves where the water seemed completely transparent. The children were thrilled to be able to swim in the clear mountain lake, although the water was still quite cold. In the evening, Jack built a fire, Kathleen prepared dinner, and Tammy and Oliver roasted marshmallows. Occasionally, other tourists passed by, greeting them with short phrases, as the Murphy camp was located in one of the clearings specially designated for camping. On the third night, when it was already past midnight, the Murphy family was awakened by screams coming from somewhere in the darkness on the other side of the bushes. Kathleen woke up first and immediately woke Jack, who in turn told the children to stay in the tent. The screams were sometimes piercing, sometimes quiet, with intervals in between. It sounded like someone was calling for help. Jack and Kathleen, worried that something might be wrong, decided to call the rangers, but first they wanted to determine where the sounds were coming from. Jack grabbed a flashlight. Kathleen grabbed a pepper spray canister. They both knew that grizzlies and other predators could be roaming around at night. They left the camp about 30 or 40 meters away, where the bushes gave way to a more open clearing near the lake shore. Suddenly, the screams stopped abruptly, and for a few seconds, there was an ominous silence, broken only by the wind rustling softly in the pine needles. At that moment, the Murphys saw the rangers approaching, who had been called by one of the neighboring campers. Together, the Murphys and the 2 park rangers decided to search the surrounding area. A few minutes later, they stumbled upon a gruesome scene. About 20 meters from the bushes stood a torn tent that resembled a shredded piece of cloth. Its poles were broken, and pieces of fabric lay scattered on the ground. Everything pointed to a violent attack, as if some large animal or other force had torn the camp apart. Nearby, they found the body of a tourist who, judging by the scraps of clothing, appeared to be a lone traveler, but no documents were found on him. The body looked as if someone had torn it into small pieces. The limbs were separated from each other, the entrails were exposed, and the face was almost impossible to recognize under the bloody wounds. At the sight of this horror, Kathleen stepped aside, feeling a wave of panic, while one of the rangers, who introduced himself as Ryan Cooper, began to examine the surrounding area for clues. It seemed logical to assume that this was an attack by a bear or other predator. However, the nearest 100 square meters contained no clear paw prints or blood trails leading deeper into the forest. The ground and grass within a radius of several meters were churned up and covered in blood, but there were no discernible tracks. It was also puzzling that there was no food waste or anything else nearby that could have attracted a predator. Soon more rangers arrived, followed by medics and one of the park's senior inspectors to document the incident. The body was removed and taken to a morgue in a nearby town. The police who arrived shortly afterwards were unable to identify the deceased. He had no ID, no phone, and no notes. The only item found nearby was a torn package of energy bars. According to official documents, the deceased was recorded as Jane Doe, as many services continue the historical practice of using the same term regardless of gender when the identity is unknown. Jack and Kathleen were questioned at length about what they had seen and heard. But the couple could only say one thing. They heard piercing screams and found a body torn to pieces. They were told to sign a short statement and then advised to forget about that night, as such details could cause them stress and anxiety. The Murphy family was alarmed, but they did not argue with the rangers. They just wanted to finish their hike and get home as soon as possible. Late in the morning, the Murphy family gathered and left, forever changing their attitude toward long trips into the wilderness. None of them could get the horrific scene out of their heads, the destroyed tent and pieces of flesh scattered across the grass. What really happened, a predatory attack or something inexplicable, remained a mystery. The park's reports default to wild animal attack, but the lack of tracks around the area casts doubt on even the most experienced rangers. The name of the deceased tourist, recorded as Jane Doe, was never established, sinking into anonymity, surrounded by the silence of the tall pine trees near Lake McDonald. In the fall of October 2003, 4 student friends from a university in the eastern United States set out on a hiking trip along the famous Appalachian Trail. This route, stretching for many hundreds of kilometers along the mountain range, had long attracted nature lovers and outdoor enthusiasts and remained the subject of various legends and unexplained stories. But the young travelers didn't believe in scary stories. They were full of enthusiasm and planned to see the bright colors of the autumn forest and test their strength in difficult conditions. Their names were Tom, Brian, Martha, and Kevin, and they were all second-year students. 2 specialized in biology, 1 in history, and another in journalism. According to their friends, they had prepared for this trip in advance and felt experienced enough for such an expedition. The beginning of their journey was quite successful. On the first day, the group managed to cover several dozen kilometers along well-marked sections of the trail, admiring the mountain slopes and trees covered with yellow leaves. The weather was typical for autumn, cool nights and mild sunshine during the day. They set up camp on time, built a fire, and prepared simple meals from dried foods and herbs. From early morning until dusk, the students managed to cover the planned sections without losing their enthusiasm. Tom and Brian, who were studying biology, paid special attention to the local flora and tried to identify rare plants, while Martha, a history major, talked about the past of these mountains, mentioning the indigenous people and the first settlers. Kevin, a future journalist, jotted down his impressions in a notebook, planning to write an article for the student newspaper. On the second day, they left the busy areas where they might encounter other tourists and ventured deeper into the more secluded areas of the mountain range. The trails there were still well marked, but they encountered people much less frequently. In the evening, after pitching their tent on a flat spot near a forest stream, the students noticed that there was almost complete silence, broken only by the sounds of insects and the faint rustling of leaves. They even liked it. They wanted to experience the real wilderness. However, even then, Brian mentioned that he felt as if someone was watching them from deep in the forest. The others just laughed and attributed his feeling to the general tension of the trip and the approaching twilight. On the third day, in the morning, they continued along a less obvious part of the trail, which was littered with fallen branches and vines in places. At lunchtime, the students came out onto a small clearing. There they decided whether to stop for a rest or continue on to reach a flatter area by evening. At that moment, they had their first real cause for concern. Kevin, who had gone to examine the bushes at the far end of the clearing, suddenly returned with a worried look on his face and said that he had seen a huge silhouette flash between the trees. Tom joked that it was probably just a bear or a moose, but Kevin disagreed, saying that the figure looked too much like a human, only disproportionately large. Not everyone took his words seriously, but the tension among the group grew. They decided not to waste much time in that spot and moved on, keeping in a square formation. No one wanted to break away from the group. By evening, they reached a relatively flat area of forest near a small lake. There was enough room in the tent for 4, and they usually slept 5, or rather 4, but with the local equipment. This time, before going to sleep, someone suggested taking turns keeping watch, if only for peace of mind. Half of the group thought it was unnecessary. The likelihood of encountering predators on the Appalachian Trail was low, and traces of large animals were rare in this area. But Kevin and Brian insisted that they would take turns staying awake. Kevin would take the first half of the night, and Brian would take the second. In the middle of the night, around 1 or 2 in the morning, Kevin turned on his radio and told his friends from the other group, who were staying at base camp, far from this section, that he could hear strange footsteps in the dark and the rustling of branches. His voice sounded tense but definitely not hysterical. Soon, Kevin reported, "Tom woke up and says there's something looming behind the trees." The dispatcher asked for more details and a description of the creature, but all he heard in response was noise that sounded like random screams and some kind of crackling. Suddenly, the radio went silent. Of course, within the next few hours, Forest Service employees and a couple of experienced volunteer tourists set out to search for the students using the approximate coordinates. But it was night and in the mountains, where it is easy to get lost without clear landmarks. They only managed to reach the presumed area at dawn. What they saw was a depressing sight. The tent was torn to shreds, not just damaged by claws, but literally turned into ragged strips of fabric and broken frame poles. About 10 meters away, they found the bodies of Brian, Martha, and Tom. They were lying in different positions, as if they had been thrown or scattered across the ground. 2 of them had obvious wounds from severe blows, and one had traces of powerful lacerations that did not look like animal bites. The ground around them was noticeably torn up, but there were no clear chains of paw or footprints, just a jumble of soil, leaves, and branches. The 4th student, Kevin, was found a little further into the forest. He was alive but in deep shock, and it was impossible to establish normal contact with him. His clothes were covered in mud and torn in places, but no serious injuries were visible. People immediately called a medical helicopter to take the survivor to the nearest hospital as quickly as possible. On the way, Kevin regained consciousness once, opened his eyes for a few seconds, and tried to say something. According to the medics, his only intelligible phrase was, "It was a huge man." After that, Kevin fell into a coma caused by severe psychological shock and possibly a hidden traumatic brain injury. An investigation launched by local authorities sought to explain the 3 deaths and the strange injuries to the tent and bodies. The official version, as stated in the reports, was that the students had been attacked by an aggressive bear. There have indeed been occasional attacks by black bears on the Appalachian Trail, most often provoked by the unexpected appearance of people or the presence of strong-smelling food among hikers. However, many details did not match the characteristic signs of a bear attack. Usually, bears tear their prey with their claws and try to drag the body or remains of food away. But here, everything looked different. The victims were lying close to each other. Nothing had been eaten or dragged away. In addition, experienced hunters said that a bear attack on soft forest soil would certainly have left clear traces of paws and powerful claws. Here, however, only chaotic commotion was found, as if someone or something had fought and trampled the ground with considerable force, but without leaving any distinct prints. One of the victims had such a severe skull fracture that it looked as if he had been struck with a massive hard object, not a bear's body or paw. Doubts grew among the searchers and some Forest Service employees as they recalled Kevin's mention of a man and the strange silhouette they had seen in the forest the day before. Nevertheless, officials, including representatives of the Department of Natural Resources, insisted on the version of a large aggressive bear, possibly standing on its hind legs and therefore mistaken for a human-like creature. Some sections of the trail had to be closed indefinitely to catch the predator. However, there was no actual confirmation that such a man-eating bear was roaming the area. Neither hunters nor rangers managed to find an animal matching the description. Meanwhile, the student town where the victims and the survivor came from was rocked by a flurry of rumors. Some whispered about legends of mountain hermits who grew to enormous sizes, while others recalled stories of possible relict humanoid creatures. But all these discussions took place unofficially, behind closed doors. Soon, when Kevin was discharged from the hospital, it became clear that he was in psychological isolation. He was prescribed rehabilitation and a series of sessions with psychiatrists. The young man was urged not to voice any fantastic versions of what he had seen. Otherwise, they said, it would be more difficult for him to return to normal life. Some acquaintances from the university said that Kevin had tried several times to share his memories of the nighttime attack, but his relatives and doctors discouraged him, fearing that reliving the nightmare would only exacerbate the trauma. Officially, the whole story was reduced to a single document. The deaths of 3 students were the result of an accident caused by an attack by a wild animal. The surviving victim is advised to refrain from making public comments. Among cryptozoologists, who are abundant on amateur websites, the incident was discussed in the context of the Sasquatch theory, commonly known as Bigfoot. Some pointed to parallels with other rare but strange episodes in which tourists reported seeing a big man in the woods and then found torn tents and dying people with no signs of a classic bear attack. Official science, represented by nature conservation departments and the police, maintains that these are all fabrications or private delusions, as there is no reliable scientific evidence of such a creature. There was no one to protest. The families of the victims did not want to get involved in public disputes, and Kevin himself remained silent. In the end, the story that took place in October 2003 on the Appalachian Trail was formally concluded as an accident. Friends of the victims remember them at the university on a memorial stand, saying that they were simply victims of an unfortunate encounter with a bear. However, some rescue workers who participated in the search and saw how the tent was literally torn to shreds and the horrific injuries the young men sustained still doubt the plausibility of this version. According to them, the scene of the attack looked so unusual that they couldn't even think of black bears. But since no other suspects were found in the forest, it was pointless to argue with the official conclusions. Years have passed, and the Appalachian Trail continues to welcome thousands of tourists every year, as it is one of the most popular hiking trails in the country. Newcomers are not always aware of the tragedy that occurred in the depths of autumn, or they do not attach any significance to it. Only those who remember sometimes tell myths around the campfire about a giant man lurking in the Appalachian forests, stories that are rarely taken seriously. But among experienced hunters and local historians, there is sometimes a quiet rumor that even today, unexplained traces and tears in tents are sometimes found. But no one wants to risk their reputation by speaking about it publicly. So the truth remains classified as an official conclusion about an aggressive bear, and the fourth student who once muttered about a huge man while in a coma now keeps his silence. That's all. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. And most importantly, write in the comments what you think about all this. Are the bears really to blame, or are the authorities hiding something more terrible? Be careful in the wild, because no one knows what might be waiting for us there in the darkness.